Left 4 Dead 2 is, to be honest, a solved game. It has been out since 2009, and the long-term players have certainly figured it out to a science. Even if you aren't that long-standing of a player though, nowadays chances are if you launch Left 4 Dead for the first time, it's not the first game you have ever touched. And due to the game's straightforward nature, a lot of what you have already learned from playing other games carries over very well. So the end result is, the last time I remember leaving an expert game defeated, knowing I couldn't beat it, was the Last Stand finale in September 2020 before its hotfix nerf, and before that, it was the Christmas season of 2009, as a group of me and 3 randoms spent 6 hours trying to get past the Dark Carnival barns before finally phoning it in. Otherwise, basically every game I play in eventually sees my team reaching the end. Sometimes the game makes us work a bit for it, other times it's clearly a very elite lobby and we're beating the campaign in under 25 minutes. So with that being said, we are going to evaluate and try to answer once and for all, which is the hardest campaign in Left 4 Dead 2. Quick rule of thumb before we examine this. First off, tier lists like this are always, at the end of the day, subjective. I'm going to provide rationale, but at the end of the day, everyone's different. Different attributes of a game counter different people in different ways, and what I say is ultimately not going to be final. The idea of tier lists, however, is not to be viewed individually, but to look at multiple tier lists as a whole, and that's where you'll get your best idea. Likewise, I've had runs where supposedly the easiest campaigns made us work for it, while other runs have been on the hardest of the hard campaigns, and it was the easiest thing in the world. Game director, teammates, and ultimately your own decision making are the biggest contributors to how a game is going to go. I don't want to take up too much time looking at the non-hardest campaigns, but we will, so let's do this. The TLDR is, I think the 4 hardest campaigns in the game, in no particular order, are Last Stand, Cold Stream, Dark Carnival, and Hard Rain. Skip to this timestamp if you want to skip to those. Honorable mentions to The Passing and Swamp Fever. Radical. Before we hone in on this, we're going to very quickly go over the other campaigns, and by very quickly, I mean not very quickly. And to start that off, I will display this graphic on your screen. This graphic is my rough notes, where I basically looked at each campaign chapter in a vacuum and hot take rated its difficulty on a scale of green, yellow, and red. And I'm not bothering to proofread or go back on it. This is just the gut instinct, aka which chapters have inflicted the most PTSD on me over the last 15 years. This is what I had before getting more rational, questioning myself, typing up the script, etc. Green is easy, yellow is medium, red is hard. You'll have to pause the video if you want to keep looking because I am now skipping to the easiest campaign in the game has got to be Crash Course. It is 2 chapters long and the 2 chapters themselves are not really exceptional. Chapter 1 is decently long, but its holdout event is very easy. Chapter 2 is decently long and then its holdout event is also one of the easier ones. The surprise factor of the generator cutting off after the first tank is made easier with the port into Left 4 Dead 2 because of bile jars and adrenaline. However, there are also 2 points that should not be underestimated in general. The first is that when you have a longer chapter, there's this factor that can dent morale if you have to reset and go back to the beginning. It's not the biggest thing in the world, but to have to repeat all of that progress, especially if you were near the end, can play into the patience of a player, but it can also play into the mindset and the pressure that someone feels once they're closer to the end of the chapter. But Crash Course genuinely isn't a campaign we see that many restarts in. There's a lot of places to reliably hold out, and it's not like it's lacking on item and weapon spawns in general. The second is, normally with finales, you spawn in a safe house with first aid kits, then a couple of minutes later you are at the finale, and then you have more med kits. In Crash Course, you do not have this luxury actually. You have the first aid kits at the start of the chapter, but then you have to go through all of chapter 2 before seeing med kits at the finale, and there isn't this little buffer about 1 to 2 minutes before you get to that finale. So you only have the 8 med kits unless the game decides to start spawning you more. So it does count for something, but it doesn't count enough to avoid being placed as the easiest campaign in the game on my list. The second easiest to me has got to be No Mercy. And No Mercy is also a complete classic and it's one of my favorites. In general, the campaigns from Left 4 Dead 1 are easier because there were less tools in mind when it was being created. There weren't any bile jars, there weren't adrenaline shots. Playtesters didn't even have as much Left 4 Dead experience under their belt at the time because it didn't exist. But No Mercy is also the easiest because it was intended to be. Chapter 1, for instance, has you walk through all of these hallways so that the in-game tips can tell you to close doors behind you, which makes that easier. Then the only event is an optional or sometimes accidental one with the car. Even with the additions of the spitter and the charger, having access to so many choke points and rooms makes holdouts easier because there's only so many directions zombies can come from and it's easier to play off of that. Chapter 2's event gives you 2 free gas cans, and the minigun room is an easy room to play off of. Chapter 3's event has like 4 viable rooms in close proximity that can be held out in. Chapter 4 is where it starts to get a little tedious, but I found that if you've already got people ready to hold out in that one room at the end of the long hallway, it's really not all that stressful. And in the rooftop finale, there are a couple strong spots we see people use frequently, and it's probably one of the best places to be kiting a tank, period. I would have to rank Crash Course as easier than No Mercy, but I want to kind of bundle up these tiers in general. So I'm putting Crash Course and No Mercy on the same tier as the easiest campaigns in the game. Now for the next tier of campaigns, I've got Death Toll, Dead Center, and Dead Air. These are all campaigns where I've seen a fair share of games going on a bit longer than necessary sometimes, but ultimately it boils down to things are generally easygoing, and then there's 1, maybe 2 points of contention that make you kind of have to stop and work for it a bit. Death Toll is my personal favorite campaign in the entire game. I feel like it's got a bit of everything. But anyways, Chapter 1's only real note is to be careful of the trees on the side at the very, very beginning, because infected can spawn in there. If you move too forward, too fast, then you can have zombies running up to you from behind as well as in the front. Chapter 2 has the world's best tank kiting ring, and the Drains event usually has throwables and spots where you can stand to make the infected unable to climb up underneath you. Chapter 3 can take a little bit longer, and if you lose at the church event, it's annoying. However, the game spoon feeds you like at least 4 gas cans there, and it's very easy to chain them in that one choke point from behind the benches. Chapter 4 is noteworthy because of the event where you have to run, and without adequate pipe bomb or bile jar usage, it does kind of complicate things. However, once you get to the stairs, you are basically home free. Chapter 5 is an easy holdout. You can do 2 people on each side of the back porch. You can have everyone hold out on the boat dock. You can even do that little shack off to the side if you want. You can hold out on the second floor. No shortage of options and throwables. Dead Center is a great campaign for beginners, seeing as it is the first campaign in Left 4 Dead 2. It introduces you to melee weapons, and oftentimes there's the deagle as well. They are longer chapters in general, but it is also where they start to introduce uncommon zombies. In Swamp Fever, they gave you Mudmen. In Hard Rain, it's Hard Hat Workers. In Dead Center, they're establishing how Lost Cause's apocalypse is because there's CETA hazmat workers who are infected, and they also happen to drop a lot of bile jars, which happens to be probably the strongest throwable in the entire game. So you've got all these rooms to hold out in. The balconies are kind of traps, and then you have a bile jar by the time you get to the elevator, and then you chuck it into the fire, and then that's your run. Chapter 2 is also a bit longer, but also introduces you to the gun store where you can have any loadout you want. And the cola event becomes easy when you have 2, sometimes just 1 person run in, grab the cola, and then throw it up to a teammate who's already waiting there. Chapter 3 is, in my opinion, the most difficult one, but it's not too bad. The only thing of note is the running event, but that's also one of the shorter ones, and then you have a room to hold out in afterwards. The gas can finales are definitely harder than holdout finales on average, but this one just having the different levels where 2 people can run up and just throw the gas cans down to 2 other people, that works very well. Also works well to just have all 4 people stick together and just throw everything down, and then load up all 13 at once. It also helps that the arena is very wide open. There are so many opportunities to be able to save a teammate from a range if needed. So long as there's some level of coordination amongst teammates, you're going to have an easier time on this one. And lastly, Dead Air. Dead Air Chapter 1 has nothing noteworthy about it aside from also giving you 4 Molotovs and 4 pipe bombs to start off with for some reason, so you're already off to a really good start. Chapter 2 is a bit longer, and there's certainly a couple areas that can be pretty awkward to fight a tank in. However, the crane event gives you 2 gas cans, and there's no shortage of places you can hold out in. Chapter 3 is a bit longer, however the construction site event also has a very easy spot to hold out in, and would you believe it, it gives you more gas cans. And Chapter 4 is where it starts to get a bit more difficult for sure. You don't necessarily want to be fighting a tank in the crowded corridors. The truck event has a number of answers to it, but the most effective one always seems to be running back to where, you guessed it, there's gas cans, right next to a room where the infected can only come through one choke point. It is important to note, however, that despite this, it can sometimes go wrong anyways. Someone has to hit the van, then run all the way back, and if people are just autopiloting, it's quite possible for something to go wrong during the time someone is running back, because the infected start spawning before that person can get to the room, and especially when you think, oh shoot, someone's in trouble, I gotta start shooting, whoop, 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 whoop. Suddenly you shot a gas can and it goes wrong. So that counts for something, but ultimately Dead Air's peak difficulty comes from the running event at the end of Chapter 4, and that has to be one of the more tedious ones I've seen. The chairs in the waiting area at the end can make things awkward, and so you often find yourself pinned against the glass running up and down there, But of course, one bottle jar and suddenly it's not as complicated, though one bottle jar won't buy you the whole run, one pipe bomb won't buy you the whole run. Then the holdout finale, honestly, you can probably make a whole video showcasing the different places you can hold out in, on top of the tanker truck, underneath the escape plane's wing, on top of this crashed plane, on top of this crashed plane, in this far back corner, this hill, pick your poison, they all work. Now we are at our midpoint, where I have to place the Sacrifice, Blood Harvest, and the Parish. The Sacrifice, being only 3 chapters, plays into its ease, but especially the first 2 chapters are significant in length. Chapter 1 also has the guaranteed tank fight, which also comes with a horde, and it's not always generous in terms of what items you have at this point. I've had a lot of games where we just had to do it with no fire and tier 1 weapons, and if we're lucky, a hunting rifle. This little arena isn't the most ideal place to be fighting a tank in general because there's not really any viable high ground options, and these bricks that the tank can punch are also kind of awkward as well. Chapter 2's length is also very significant, and its layout gives way to a number of places where it's awkward to fight a horde. The game does give you some health before the big gravel hill event, but usually at this point your team isn't exactly the most healthy all around anyways. This event does have some things that make it go easier in its favor, such as 2 people watching each side of the bridge, or you can make it to the bridge and then there's a lot of open space on the boat itself you can hold out in, or you can have one person run up the hill just to bait the crows and then run back down. What makes this such a curveball though is the fact that the horde triggers once the first person has reached the top of the hill, and because of the forced walk speed on it, usually infected have caught up to the 4th, sometimes 3rd person on their way up there, depending on how spread out everyone is. Without throwables, making it to the top of this hill with zombies on top of you is a huge pain. If you play a drinking game with your buddies, take a shot for each person that gets incapped right at the mouth of this bridge. As for the finale, it's actually not all that bad, and it's why this campaign isn't rated any higher. Being able to start all 3 generators at once and then hold out together is a huge plus, and then you're really just kind of fighting one tank at a time usually. The actual Sacrifice itself, the gas can or Molotov placements make themselves, just take one look at it. The timing of the pipe bomb and bottle jar are also very telegraphed, everyone knows what's coming, and there's no shortage of throwables that spawn at the minigun to cover the person running. Blood Harvest is interesting because I feel like in theory it should be an easier campaign, but I often see it go awry on chapters 4 and 5 more frequently than it should. Generally speaking, chapter 1, nothing too crazy, but also no shortage of trees at the very beginning, so you can't just run ahead. But other than that, it's pretty straightforward. Hold out in the house for a horde, hug the chain link fence, you're good to go. Chapter 2, the event has a lot of very easy spots to hold out in, and there's gas cans, and the obvious gas can placements, and then the tunnels are easy. Chapter 3 is a bit longer in length, and it is also where it starts to get a little tedious, more trees once you emerge outside, and then when you end up on the train tracks, the running event usually ramps up by the time you get up the bridge. So many infected run out of that safe house like a clown car, so if you don't have a throwable, or if you just simply aren't ready for it, it gets pretty weird pretty quickly. Chapter 4 also starts off with trees. The area once you jump down is awkward to fight tanks in, and the running event seems to always have some sort of sucker punch somewhere. Ultimately, Chapter 5 is where it gets nasty because a lot of times you get a tank right at the beginning, and then you also have to push through the cornfield, and that usually goes down with people just running right through it, and it's not uncommon for someone to go down in that corn, and then running back to get them with minimal information is never fun. So usually you just let them die and then they respawn, and there you go. The actual holdout event though is fairly straightforward. Usually it's just people chilling on the barn roof, the barn's 2nd floor, the glitch spot underneath this window, or just flat out in the middle of the open by this telephone pole. Generally speaking, I think Blood Harvest is the easiest of the campaigns in this tier. However, a combination of the trees and multiple running events provides unique challenges that a lot of players might not respect, especially in their earlier playthroughs. If this was a tier list for strictly veteran players, Blood Harvest isn't going to be ranked as high because once you respect the unique layout of this campaign, it becomes much easier, but not everyone is a veteran, and not all of your lobbies are exclusively veteran players. And for those reasons, and because I myself have seen a lot of playthroughs get uncharacteristically stumped on this one, I have to put it in the mid tier. As for the Parish, this is also a personal favorite of mine. I think the first 2 chapters are pretty easy. Chapter 1 is nice, Chapter 2 has some length to it, and it ends with a running event, but usually one throwable is all you need to get to the scaffold, and then you're doing pretty well with that high ground. There's also usually no shortage of adrenaline to start it off with. Chapters 3 and 4, however, is where it starts to ramp up in terms of length. Chapter 3's length is absurd, and the alarm cars are never not nerve-wracking when a bad timing alarm goes off. And have you ever fought a tank in this car park? I gotta say it's probably one of the most thrilling fights I've ever had. and then you never really know what you're going to get with the cemetery. Usually it's alright, but the sheer length of the chapter does stand out to me. Again, keeping in mind that Left 4 Dead is a game where shit happens, and things can go wrong very quickly. Long campaigns have higher chances of things like that happening. And if it does happen, well, it's like we mentioned before about the patience and the pressure that having to redo all of that progress can do to a player. Between the car park, the sewer, the few places where you can't turn back certainly provides no shortage of those opportunities to take place. Chapter 4 absolutely has seen a ton of restarts on it. There are just so many twists and turns that aren't ideal for kiting tanks in, and the Parade Float event has a lot of unique angles the survivors can get flanked on. Normally people like to hide out in the corner with fire, and that makes it go pretty well. But like if someone falls down a level, it can be detrimental, and there's a cheeky alarm card placement near the end too. So the length and opportunities for things to go wrong certainly mount up. But personally, what I find helps aids the parish's difficulty as a whole is the bridge event. I think it's one of the easier events all around. It's one of the easier ones for people to just solo rush if they just want to take the campaign into their own hands. I find that if you want to get the most enjoyment out of it, I need to slow the pace down and properly fight across the bridge with my team and earn every bit of space. However, at any point, if we decide that this is it, this is enough, anyone can just speedrun it, and eventually, within 3 minutes, the helicopter's taking off. Earlier, I gave my honorable mentions to Swamp Fever and The Passing. These are the two I'm putting in my second hardest tier. Swamp Fever, I think, is the harder of these two, particularly because it is 4 chapters. None of these 4 chapters particularly stand out to me over each other, but they are all lengthy with a lot of areas of water slowing you down and trees enabling infected flanks. That said, all of the holdout events in each chapter have very easy places to hold out on. So the difficulty of this campaign definitely comes from just the sheer endurance and the consistency that you have to exercise in between those events. Chapter 1, it's running back to the house, which has some problems which we went over before about trying to start an event and then run back somewhere. But the one-way ladder really makes it easy once you're there. The second chapter has this back corner by the tail of the plane. The third chapter has these 2 roofs that you can stand on top of, and the finale has this stairwell where the infected need to get funneled in. So the events themselves are pretty manageable, but it's all the time in between that lends itself to a lot of opportunities for things going wrong. Fighting 2 tanks at once in the finale is also notable. There are options for kiting the tanks in general, but there are more ideal places in the game to be kiting tanks that aren't the tight corridors of the mansion or the backyard hedges. The Passing is also a campaign whose difficulty more so comes from the lengths of the chapters, and the occasional thunderstorm impedes your vision, and that's especially noteworthy when it's realism. Nothing in particular stands out in the first chapter other than the not uncommon tank fights which occur with only starter weapons with a lot of punchable cars around, but also the Bride Witch is an optional event you don't really need to take part in. However, the second chapter definitely stands out because after you slog along a lengthy chapter, it ends with a dimly lit finale that involves running through water while pushing a never-ending horde through a tunnel. It isn't anything good usage of adrenaline and throwables can't solve, but that's also just Left 4 Dead in general. Ideally, a bile jar or a pipe bomb to open up to get you to that first ladder is usually enough, and then sometimes a Molotov behind you once you're in the tunnel, but that's kind of contextual. However, if you don't have those tools, suddenly this is one of the most unforgiving and challenging events in the game. And if you need to restart, you're all the way back to the beginning of the long chapter. The final event, I think, is certainly one of the hardest events in the game period as well. Scavenge will always be the hardest finale archetype in my opinion. In Dead Center, it's more manageable because of those wide open spaces. But in The Passing, there are simply so many walls you can't shoot through, geometry you have to navigate around, and it requires some of the highest amounts of coordination in teams in the game period. This is a game where things can go wrong very quickly, as I've hammered home so many times in my videos, and the conditions that this finale sets up certainly emphasizes this. There is the little safe area where the Left 4 Dead 1 survivors will throw items down and provide cover with their weapons, but that really doesn't help you that much when you need to run to the farthest corners of the map and upstairs to get 4 gas cans. Some people put this campaign in their top 3 most difficult, and I honestly can't blame them. I think there's a real good case to be made. However, when I look at the campaign as a whole, while this finale is difficult and while the chapter 2 is difficult, I think the campaign only being 3 chapters long, with the first chapter being long but only middling in difficulty, with the second event being much easier with a single non-Molotov throwable, makes up for it in that respect. We are now entering the top 4 hardest on my list, the thumbnails to this video, and one of these is going to be put into the same tier as The Passing and Swamp Fever. So which one is it? I will have to put in Hard Rain. I think it's quite close between Hard Rain and the other ones, but this is where it gets so close it's genuinely debatable, and I've even flip-flopped on this a couple of times while prepping and making this video, but I think Hard Rain especially stands out because of Chapter 2. Chapter 1 is a little long, but ultimately uneventful, and you even get to start off with a sniper, sometimes a deagle, and it's a pretty wide open chapter too, so that kind of makes up for any difficulty that you're about to be encountering. But yeah, we get to chapter 2, the sawmill, and you've got everything that can go wrong. In the sawmill, you have geometry that can cause the infected to flank you. You have a huge abundance of witches. That means suddenly you can't just throw grenades and have it be a guaranteed benefit. There are a couple of long patches where tank fighting is ideal, but it's usually awkward anyways. Then you have an event where, fortunately, you can have 2 people stand on these 2 pipes to prevent infected from coming from beneath, or you can stack people in this corner, but it still gets dicey because of the 3rd pipe across from the elevator that can't be blocked. A lot can go wrong with chargers, boomers, and jockeys coming from there alone because there usually isn't a lot of time to react to them. Then you get into the plants, which block your vision, where there's going to be even more witches. And this is a moot point in realism, but since it's not geometry blocking your vision but foliage, props, you can't even see your teammates unless they're right next to you or very, very far away. Every single thing that can go wrong in this game, as I said, can happen in the sawmill. It is constantly testing you and making your life miserable in different ways with every reset. I've had playthroughs where we whiz by this chapter easy peasy, and I'm sure a lot of experienced players watching this video have too, but I know a lot of you have also had runs where this chapter alone has cycled your runs by at least 30 minutes minimum. No one flukes their way through the sugar mill. However, luckily, chapters 3 and 4 are so easy it's like they don't even exist, and it's why Hard Rain does not go into my top 3. The game has a predetermined path for you that's easier to run through, including a lot of high ground which makes fighting hordes ideal. Tank fights aren't the most straightforward during these chapters, but usually one person just speedruns it and it's not a problem. Despite chapter 2 being probably one of the hardest in the entire game, chapters 3 and 4 are so easy, it doesn't even matter. Chapter 5 is also not the best. Holding out on top of the burger tank roof is usually not bad, but it's probably one of the worst places to be holding out against a tank in, and you have to do it twice. Too much can go wrong. You can only kite in that smaller area on the roof, and if you jump down the roof, you're now walking really slow. You want to light the tank on fire. Now you're kind of kiting the tank around this small area, and then there's also fire you have to avoid. If the tank jumps down for any reason, it just undoes that. And also, if you ever wanted to switch up your tier 2 weapons in the middle of this event, you can't. You only have the tier 1 weapons. And that's kind of a moot point as well, but it is something to consider. Now, lastly, actually getting to the boat has bad timing, and if you go straight to it, chances are the tank is right at your doorstep before the boat even shows up. The best way to counteract this is to be patient. Wait it out a bit and let the boat get closer, allow the tank to climb up onto the building before throwing your utility, and then run for it. So take this holdout finale and everything about chapter 2, I have to put Hard Rain in my top 4. But honestly, one day I might think that this is the 4th hardest, another day I might put The Passing as my 4th hardest, and another day I might put Swamp Fever as my 4th hardest. But the Sugar Mill alone, I think, has to command so much respect that it's hard to imagine a top 4 without it. So now we are in the top 3. To reveal these 3, I don't want to do 3rd and then 2nd and then 1st. For suspense, I'd rather spin this wheel. Okay, so we're going to look at Last Stand first, and then we will look at Dark Carnival. And then we'll look at Coldstream, and then I'll rank which ones I think are the hardest. The Last Stand is infamously just 2 chapters, but they are both very difficult chapters. It's important to know that The Last Stand was not officially made by Valve, rather mappers with cooperation from Valve. If you are active in the Left 4 Dead 2 subreddit, you have probably seen posts before by Jays, who is an incredibly smart individual who knows this game inside and out, almost as if he was someone that actually worked on the game. His presence alone stands out to me, and it's worth mentioning because that's the type of people you're dealing with when you consider who made and playtested this map 10 years after the release of Left 4 Dead 2. These guys know everything that can make a map difficult, and they implemented all of it. So even if it's just 2 chapters, they're making you work for it. The first chapter is very long, and surprise, surprise, there's a lot of geometry and trees on the side that enables infected flanks. Then you also have some high water that slows you down. It doesn't last very long, but then after you pass that, there's even more trees, and then you have an event that combines holding out and running. The way this event is scripted is that when the generators run out, each generator that is flipped spawns its own alarm car-sized horde. So it is most efficient to have all 4 of you spread out and hit them at the same time before reconverging and holding out together. This of course forces your hand if you only have 3 people, or 2, or God forbid, 1. Spreading out is also not really the strategy for Left 4 Dead anyways, so here's a case where it forces you to break some unwritten rules of the game just to efficiently get by it. Then there are more trees and these high cliffs onto the side that infected can jump down and abuse the high ground of to enable these flanks. And of course, any reset takes you right back to the very beginning of the campaign. When a long chapter makes you restart, it's one thing, but it's another thing when the chapter makes you go back to just the starter weapons of chapter 1. It's a bit more demoralizing. Then this finale was so difficult they had to nerf it in a hotfix. I've asked Jays what it was exactly they nerfed, and he said he thinks it was the rate at which zombies spawned during the scavenge portion. And I do remember that part specifically is what stumped my friends and I over and over and over and over again during the brief period that it was first released. We never beat it on expert before this nerf. But after the nerf, we've been able to defeat it, but it wasn't really smooth sailing at first. Now actually holding out against the zombies on top of the roof is great, and it's always beneficial to let the survivor zombies run up to you before you kill them so that their dropped goods are up top with your team. However, the scavenge part is always difficult because of the trees, the walls, and this really long run you have to make downstairs. The strategy that I found to be the most effective is, I'll light the first tank on fire, and then just run down the stairs while my 3 teammates fight the tank. Lighting the tank on fire should be more than enough contribution. This enables me to be by the furthest gas cans in the shack by the time the tank dies, so I can just start juggling them up the steps immediately. This at the very least puts the gas cans at the top of the stairs, and usually by then our team is able to juggle them around and get it figured out. Having a team of 4 people always sticking together to pick up every gas can is of course very effective. Then the hordes again from the top are alright, and then fighting 2 tanks at once is not ideal here either. The lighthouse is a small building, and if you aren't fighting the tanks up and down the stairs and ladders, which is awkward, you are instead fighting them in the trees. There are a lot of opportunities to get accidentally sandwiched by these tanks. The campaign was designed by very talented, very smart Left 4 Dead 2 veterans with at least like 30 years of combined playing, and it shows. Its addition to the game has been a great breath of fresh air, and I hope that Valve sees what a success it's been, and I hope they seriously consider future collaborations such as this one. But I do wish that I could play pre-nerf Last Stand again. It was so rough. It was so rough. Usually in Left 4 Dead, things eventually just kind of team wipe you. They put down enough pressure on you and eventually your team just breaks. But this wasn't like that. This was more like it just slowly wore you out. Eventually you would need to heal or you would need to stop to do whatever, maybe get a teammate up. But there was just always at least one infected there to just ruin your day and ignore that process. And it was just the game just slowly whittled you away. It was a very unique way for Left 4 Dead to best you. And I really wish that I could play the pre-nerf version of it now that we've had some time under our belts with the nerfed version. And now we've got Dark Carnival. I know Dark Carnival. You know Dark Carnival. Noam Chomsky knows Dark Carnival. And you know exactly where this analysis is going to pinpoint. The short version of Dark Carnival analysis is that a lot of runs hinge on if you can save a bile jar from Chapter 1 for the events at the end of Chapter 4. Now let's dive deeper into that. Chapter 1 is not bad. It's a tad bit lengthy, but not by a crazy amount. The ending of Chapter 1 has a swamp with trees and water to slow you down, and then when you go up that last hill, you don't really have a lot of info peeking up it. It sucks to fight tanks in, but other than that, this chapter is usually alright. And of course, bile jars only spawn in chapters 1 or 5. Chapter 2 is more standard, and if you opt to do the gnome achievement, there are multiple fences you can throw him over to free your hands for a while. The length of this chapter is significant as well, but ultimately it's pretty normal. And as far as running events are concerned, the merry-go-round is about as short as they get, so it's not that challenging. Now, chapter 3 is where it starts to ramp up a bit. A lot can go wrong in the Tunnel of Love, namely tanks and witches, and that's excluding friendly fire chances. The roller coaster hover is also one of the more tedious events in the game. You can again throw the gnome over this fence so you can fight it, but if you're trying to save a bile jar, it can get pretty tempting here. The areas of most significance on the roller coaster is probably just getting flanked from the sides, even if they have to climb up, and breaking out of the tunnel at the end. Some runs see this event get handled quite easily, but most of them have to respect the roller coaster to some degree. But if you make it past the roller coaster, congratulations, your reward is the barns. Chapter 4 is actually very easy up until this event. Luckily, there's usually gas cans that spawn here, and like I've mentioned in my previous videos, you can drop a gas can right down here and make the fire spread around the scaffold. So long as you respect the usual smoker spawn, this saves you economy and health leading into the run. And this is where it gets rough. It's tight, so there's friendly fire and terrible to fight chargers and spitters, and there's high ground off to the right to get flanked from, and they always come out from the front too. This event ends runs. If you've got a bile jar, congratulations, but if you don't, even with pipe bombs, this becomes much harder. The problem with pipe bombs is the only good pipe bomb throw here is ahead and on the same level as you by the porta potties. But if you throw it over the rail, and most people do, then the infected end up trying to climb over the rails, but then they don't reach the explosion in time. So they just turn around and reflank you from the rails. They just don't stop spawning, even from the safe room, and sometimes there's a tank or a witch spawn there too, so good luck with that. This chapter alone is why many people consider Dark Carnival one of the hardest, and I would have to agree. Not to mention that Valve specifically made it so that bile jars do not spawn on chapters 2 and 3. You are going through chapters 2, 3, and 4, where you have to run through these events, and Valve specifically made sure that your access to the bile jar was very limited. They wanted you to experience this. They wanted you to suffer. They wanted you to know on Left 4 Dead 2's release that they were not holding back on you. And it didn't matter if you played a lot of Left 4 Dead 1. Valve made this to break you. When a team finishes this event, chances are at least someone died. It's rare to see a team of 4 make it through this alive. And then chapter 5 is pretty alright. The stage works, the back corner works, the high ground scaffold works, bile jars spawn again. Lots of fireworks. It's good. Congratulations, you've earned it. Which means lastly, it's time to mention Coldstream. Coldstream, in my mind, was a welcome addition, and to be honest, I'm confused about the hate it gets. It's fun and challenging. Chapter 1 is not very lengthy, but you do get a taste of trees, and that's kind of about it. The event afterwards, it's not the most challenging either. It's claustrophobic, but it's pretty normal, and running to the safe house is a very short task. Chapter 2, however, is why Coldstream is in our top 3. First off, stupid son. Second, infected have high ground on you up until the tank. Now, the tank fight itself can be awkward because of the limited space you have to fight in, but knowing that the tank is there does make a difference in your prep. However, there normally isn't fire, and if you do have fire, you need to make sure to light it at the top of the ladder so that you aren't trying to ring around the rows of the tank inside the fire. Then you've got more trees, more areas where the infected have high ground, and then you have to push the infected through the tunnels. What makes this only slightly easier than the Dark Carnival event is that there are normally more chances of boomer bile near you at this point. The M60 under the bridge helps too, and it helps to know that the infected does come in waves, so knowing is half the battle there, and so long as you don't try to completely bum rush it, you'll have an easier time. Otherwise, you're dealing with stubborn infected that eventually surround an isolated player and greater chances of friendly fire. Once you push into the doorway, it gets even more claustrophobic, but at least you are able to jump down the spiral of the stairs for a bit of a shortcut, and hopefully the sheer number of infected populating this room don't overwhelm you too much. This event is brutal, and failing it to restart all the way back is a complete pain. This chapter is one of the hardest in the game, period. I would say even more so than the sugar mill. Everything that can go wrong in this game happens in this chapter. You've got just a long chapter in general. You've got this tank fight where it forces you to be pretty claustrophobic. You've got this running event that is also claustrophobic and then gets even more claustrophobic. It really sets up a lot of restarts in areas you need to respect the game. When you do get past the sewer, the more open space and the infected needing to climb fences certainly does do you some favors. But that tank fight with the narrow paths that infected can jump down on you from, certainly not one of the easier things to cope with in the game. Now, chapter 3 is a bit more relaxed. The length of it is something to be discussed. The holdout event is at least much easier to hold out in. But again, the chapter is long, lastly debatedly one of the hardest finales in the game. It's right up there with the passing and the last stand finales. Running ahead when the infected have a high ground advantage on you for the greater portion of it, followed up with the claustrophobic tank fight, really sets up a lot of restarts in areas you need to respect the game. When you do get past the sewer, the more open space and the infected needing to climb fences certainly does do you some favors, but that tank fight with the narrow paths that infected can just jump down on you from, certainly not one of the easier things to cope with in the game. I've seen so many resets on this finale. But that is it. So what is the hardest campaign in the game? In third, I have ranked Dark Carnival. What makes it easier is chapters 1, 2, and 5. The Barns is home to probably the hardest event in the entire game, and the roller coaster needs to be respected, but it is not enough to crack down. I'll just skip to number 1. Coldstream. Coldstream's chapter 2 and finale are enough to mark it down in my books as the number 1 hardest campaign in the game. You got a combination of both hard events, a harder finale, and overall tough chapters that make you deal with a little bit of everything, from trees to having low ground and a long walking distance. The Last Stand is a close second in my books. Pre-nerf Last Stand would make number 1 on my list. I wish I could be playing it right now. Everything about Last Stand is undoubtedly hard, however, being only 2 chapters long and having a scavenge event that it's not as difficult as the passings. The trees are also not playing that huge of a role in the actual flanking of things, as well as lots of high ground for holding out in, establishes a lot of safe zones and opportune moments to recover. Coldstream's events are more suffocating, and the added bonus of chapters 2 and 3 being especially long helps it in that case. But all in all, I think every campaign has a nice feel to it, with different flows and patterns that make them all worth checking out on any given day. To look a bit closer, everyone is going to have different strengths and weaknesses. If you find that you have the most difficulty with high intensities and clutch situations, then Dark Carnival, The Passing, Coldstream, and The Last Stand might give you the most trouble. But if you find that it is endurance tests that get to you more, then you might not have as great of a time in Hard Rain, Coldstream, or Swamp Fever. But again, lastly, this isn't the easiest, most objective thing to nail down. Again, having played so many games, I've seen so many lobbies that make every campaign look like Crash Course, but also had campaigns where even something like No Mercy or Dead Air makes us need to restart a few times. Your decision making, your teammates' decision making, and the director can all play factors into how your game works out. But it's still fun to try to discuss these things anyway. Do you agree with my rankings? What are yours? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you guys next time. Hopefully not in another year, like this video took.
Oh, I heard Jar Jar Binks go, oh no, and I thought it was Speggy's character dying in the distance.
It'd be really funny if I shot you and ruined the clap.
Speggy, now's your chance.
We're taking off.